Deterrence theory sounds abstract until you realize your phone, your maps, your weather reports, your bank timing signals, your military communications, and a fair portion of modern war all lean on satellites circling over your head. Once you see that, the militarization of space stops sounding like science fiction and starts sounding like a fact of ordinary life with very expensive consequences. For years, people liked to talk about space as if it were some pristine sanctuary floating above politics. That was always a comforting tale. It was also nonsense. Space has been tied to military power since the opening chapter of the space age. The first great space feats were inseparable from missile technology, strategic rivalry, and national prestige. The rockets that carried instruments could also carry warheads. Humanity reached the heavens with one hand and kept the other near the holster. So when we talk about the militarization of space, we should begin with a small act of honesty. Space is already militarized. The real argument is over how much, in what form, and with what rules. Deterrence theory enters the story here. At its core, deterrence is simple. You stop an adversary from taking an action by convincing him that the cost will outweigh the benefit, or that the action will fail, or both. In plain English, deterrence says, do not start this because it will go badly for you. That idea shaped nuclear strategy during the Cold War, and now it shapes how major powers think about space systems, satellite networks, missile warning constellations, and counterspace weapons. Recent US and NATO documents both treat space as a domain essential to deterrence and defense, not as a decorative balcony attached to the real house of war. The reason is not mysterious. Space systems support forces on land, at sea, in the air, and in cyberspace. They help with navigation, intelligence collection, missile warning, precision strike, command and control, and targeting. If you can blind those systems, jam them, spoof them, damage them, or hold them at risk, you can weaken an opponent without firing a shot at his capital. You can pull fuses from the walls of his war machine and let confusion do part of the work for you. That is a very tempting option for any serious rival. This is where deterrence in space gets strange. Nuclear deterrence grew around a small number of terrifying weapons and a grim sort of clarity. Space deterrence is murkier. A satellite can be disrupted in many ways. You can jam its signal, you can spoof its data, you can dazzle or blind its sensors with lasers. You can hit its ground stations. You can cyber attack the networks that operate it. You can launch an interceptor. You can move another satellite close to it and create a servicing mission that suddenly looks less like servicing and more like a knife fight in a telephone booth. Space is full of dual-use hardware and ambiguous behavior. That ambiguity is the mischief maker in the room. So deterrence in space cannot rely on one trick. It tends to rest on three broad ideas. The first is deterrence by punishment. If you attack my space systems, I will impose costs on you, in space or elsewhere. The second is deterrence by denial. If you attack my space systems, you still will not get the result you want, because my architecture is resilient, redundant, and hard to cripple. The third is deterrence through signaling and uncertainty. I make it clear that I am watching, that I can attribute hostile acts, and that you should not assume a clean, cheap victory. States do not like gambling when the casino is on fire. Punishment gets the headlines because it sounds muscular. It appeals to the inner dramatist in every strategist. Yet denial is often the sturdier tool in space. Why? Because a system that can survive attack, reconstitute itself, or route around damage lowers the attacker's expected gains. If your rival believes he would need to strike dozens or hundreds of nodes to get the same effect once achieved by hitting a handful of exquisite satellites, deterrence becomes less theatrical and more credible. A porcupine rarely needs a press conference. Recent Defense Department strategy has pushed this idea by leaning harder on commercial integration, proliferated architectures, and more resilient space support. That matters because the old model of space power had a dangerous flaw. It favored small numbers of very expensive, highly capable satellites. Those systems were marvelous feats of engineering. They were also juicy targets. If an adversary can threaten a few crown jewels and throw your whole military planning cycle into a panic, deterrence gets brittle. Newer thinking tries to spread risk across larger constellations, trusted commercial support, and faster replacement. It is harder to intimidate a system that behaves more like a hydra than a Fabergé egg. Still, militarizing space further carries real dangers. One is debris. Kinetic anti-satellite attacks do not merely damage one target, they can produce clouds of fragments that threaten many spacecraft, including the attacker's own. A state can win the duel and vandalize the whole neighborhood. Another danger is misperception. Because space actions are often ambiguous, a move intended as signaling can be read as preparation for attack. A close approach, a laser test, a sudden maneuver, or a burst of interference may prompt retaliation before anyone has time to sort out intent. In space, confusion can travel at orbital speed. Public threat assessments and alliance policy documents keep returning to this point. The domain is becoming more crowded, more contested, and less forgiving. There is also a political danger. The more military value we load into space, the more tempting preemption becomes during a crisis. If both sides believe the opening minutes of a conflict will decide the fate of orbital assets, each side gains an incentive to move first. That is a recipe for hair-trigger behavior. Nuclear theorists spent decades worrying about first strike incentives. Space strategists now face a cousin of that problem, though with different mechanics and a good deal more ambiguity. The result is a posture that can look defensive to one side and offensively poised to the other. International security has a talent for turning mirrors into weapons. NATO's stance is worth noting here. The alliance treats space as an operational domain and views secure access to space support as central to deterrence and defense. That does not mean NATO is trying to turn orbit into a Hollywood battle scene with laser broadsides and patriotic violins. It means modern alliance warfare depends on space services, and any serious defense posture must account for threats to them. Once an alliance admits that fact, it has already entered the politics of militarized space, whether it uses romantic language or not. The U.S. Space Force has moved in the same direction, though with its own vocabulary. Current doctrine and guidance stress space superiority, competitive endurance, and the need to protect and defend space capabilities that underpin joint force operations. That language matters. It shows a shift away from the old habit of treating space as a quiet support function, and toward a view of space as an arena where military advantage can be preserved, contested, or lost. You can hear the change in tone. It is the sound of a bureaucracy discovering that the roof has become a battlefield. China and Russia are central to this discussion because both have developed varied counterspace capabilities, from electronic warfare and cyber tools to direct ascent anti-satellite weapons and other means of interference. American public assessments have been blunt on this point. The issue is no longer whether rival powers can threaten satellites. The issue is how broad, mature, and integrated those threats have become, and how much confidence leaders have that they could use them in a crisis without triggering an unwanted spiral. That last part is where deterrence theory becomes less like geometry and more like weather. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a grim but workable conclusion. The militarization of space is not a future event. It is a present condition. The real task is to shape it in ways that reduce the odds of catastrophic miscalculation while preserving deterrence. That means building resilient architectures. It means improving attribution so hostile acts are seen clearly and fast. It means hardening ground segments because satellites are glamorous, but their earthly plumbing is often where the trouble begins. It means tighter links between military, civil, and trusted commercial systems, since modern space power is increasingly a blended ecosystem rather than a neat row of government-owned machines. It also means reviving an older strategic virtue, prudence. A great many foolish wars begin with the belief that the opening move will stay limited, tidy, and obedient. Space does not promise that. A strike meant to disable one capability can spill into debris, alliance response, cyber retaliation, and conventional escalation. The latter is there even when states pretend not to see it. Deterrence theory, then, is not a promise of peace. It is a method for managing fear, calculation, and risk, in a domain where modern civilization has made itself strangely dependent. And the militarization of space is not a corruption of some innocent frontier. It is what happens when a civilization drags its needs, rivalries, and ambitions upward with it. The old dream said the heavens would lift mankind above conflict. The record suggests something less flattering. We brought the quarrels of Earth with us, packed carefully beside the guidance systems. And now the fate of deterrence may depend on whether states can build enough resilience, enough restraint, and enough clarity to keep orbit from becoming the place where miscalculation gets a view.